In this module, we are going to be exploring how to use the UDL framework to design accessible courses. This is the heart of this entire course, and we're going to be spending a lot of modules focusing on breaking this down. But this particular module is going to overview where we're going with the rest of this course. You may recall from our first module that the vision for guiding this course is that instructional designers, that is to say faculty, at the University of Tennessee ought to be armed with the knowledge and skills necessary to apply principles that have been justified as improving access to learning for all of their students, so as to increase the quality of learning and the validity of assessments in their courses. One question you might have at this point is, which principles are we speaking of? And for this, we draw from Universal Design for Learning. You've already heard of this in earlier modules, but we're going to go a little bit further in depth now. UDL is defined as a set of principles for curriculum development that give all individuals equitable opportunities to learn and express their learning. Elsewhere, it says that UDL provides a blueprint for creating instructional goals, methods, materials, and assessments that work for everyone, not a single one-size-fits-all solution, but rather flexible approaches that can be customized and adjusted for individual needs. Within this framework, I want to focus on three big ideas: clearly articulating objectives, identifying potential barriers, and finally using the principles of learning to maximize access to learning. Let's take a look at each of these. First, it's important to see that at its heart, UDL is ultimately about design. When we think about design, it's important to recognize that good design always requires knowing the purpose for which you are designing. Let me illustrate this. Imagine that there was a woman who went to a tailor in Paris, and she requested a fine dress to be made, and she gave the tailor certain specifications, like she wanted it to have a floor-length train, and she wanted some floral embellishments and some sparkly sequins on the hip, and so forth. And as she described this, the tailor took notes and said, yes, I know what you want. I will make this dress for you. And he sends her on her way. She comes back upon his invitation a couple of weeks later, and he presents to her this dress. And it has the floor-length train and the floral embellishments and the sequins and all of the features that she described. But the woman breaks down in frustration and says, no, this is all wrong. How could I possibly use this for my wedding? And the tailor, obviously frustrated, expresses, well, you didn't tell me that it was for your wedding, and that detail, the purpose for which it was designed, makes all the difference in how it would be designed. The same argument could be made for designing a car. For what purpose? Is a minivan or a sports car the appropriate car? It depends on what it's to be used for. Is a building's purpose going to affect the way that it is designed? Of course. And yet, when we talk about designing courses in education, oftentimes we start with the textbook, we start with the materials and use that to guide our instruction, when according to the best practices of education, we should be starting by saying, where is it that I want my students to be at the end of the learning? And then we begin to think, how am I going to get them there? Thus, in the realm of design, quality and success are always and completely subjective to the goal. Without a clear objective, materials, assessments, teaching methods, etc., all have no basis for evaluation. So one of the things that we're going to address in future modules is how to clearly articulate objectives. Well-formulated objectives that are disentangled from specific methods of assessment is the basis upon which we will build our instruction. The next step is to identify potential barriers that our students might face when they are going to learn the objectives that we are teaching. These barriers, according to the research, are oftentimes very predictable if we take the time to think it through. For example, if I'm teaching an 8 o'clock class to undergraduate students, there's a strong likelihood that those students are going to be sleepy. If I'm teaching a class at the end of the day, there's a strong likelihood that those students are going to have been learning all day and their minds are going to be wearing out. This becomes real barriers to the learning that I'm going to have to address. There are other barriers that are related to the predictable variability of students that I can expect to be in my classroom. For example, I can expect here at UT that I'm going to have students in my class that are from various cultural and linguistic backgrounds, students who are from in-state and out-of-state, students who have varying degrees of interest in the content that I'm teaching because it's in their major area or not. I'm going to have students with disabilities of various types and various learning styles, etc. And when I create environments in which these recognitions do not translate into changes in how I practice and in flexibility in how I design the learning, they become real barriers that may help prevent some students or all of my students from maximizing their success and the achievement of the objective. We want to use universal design for learning principles to break through or reduce those barriers such that all of my diverse learners have access to the objectives. It's also important to recognize that even when my students achieve the objectives, they still have to show me that they have achieved the objectives because we cannot read their minds. We design assessments that allow them to show their understanding, but when the assessments are rigid and inflexible, then these too can create barriers to how our students express themselves, and students who understand content very well may find that when they're expressing their learning in a multiple choice test, or an essay, or a group project, that what they know does not come through, and therefore those barriers prevent them from demonstrating their knowledge. Again, we want to use the principles of universal design for learning to reduce or remove those barriers to allow all of our students to demonstrate their learning. We're going to be talking about those things much more in the coming modules as we'll dive into the features of Canvas that will allow us to use the principles of UDL to address those barriers for both learning and assessment. Speaking of which, once we have identified the objective, identified potential barriers that our students may face in achieving or expressing their learning of those objectives, we turn to the principles of universal design for learning to maximize the access that our students have to learning. These principles are number 1, to provide multiple means of engagement, number 2, to provide multiple means of representation, and number 3, to provide multiple means of action and expression. For each of these 3 principles, the UDL framework has 3 guidelines, making 9 guidelines in total, and each of the guidelines has between 2 and 4 checkpoints. In total, there are 31 research-based practices that have been organized into these 3 principal categories. The full framework with the principles, guidelines, and checkpoints can be found in the pages of this module. Ultimately, in using these 3 principles, our goal is to systematically reduce barriers and provide equitable access for all of our learners. You might remember that word systematically reducing barriers from our first module dealing with UDL, in which we explored this image. We saw the difference between the first pane, which focuses on equal treatment of all of our students, to the second pane, which demonstrates equitable treatment of all of our students. And finally, the third pane, which demonstrates the removal of systematic barriers altogether, such that accommodations and modifications may not be necessary for as many students as they would be otherwise. UDL will help us to do this. It is a proactive framework that will allow us to create more accessible environments such that all of our students will learn better. So what's next? Next up, throughout the rest of this course, we're going to be focusing specifically on UDL, but looking at fine details of how we can use the features of Canvas to support specific principles, checkpoints, and guidelines of UDL to make our courses more accessible. Please pick and choose as you move through those modules to decide which ones are most important or most useful for you in your courses. We hope that you will find several that, when applied over the course of time, will allow you to develop courses that are more accessible, more engaging, and just better all around, not only for your students with disabilities, but for everyone.